This is the Page Publishing Book Club. How you doing? I'm Alice Stockton Rossini. This first story just blew me away, I gotta tell you. Talking to a World War II vet with an amazing memory. I mean, how many do we have left? And their stories are so important, especially for younger generations who, can't even imagine what life was like during a world war. Charles Richardson resisted talking about his experiences, but his family finally convinced him to write it all down in his book entitled 35 Missions to Hell and Back, a mighty 8th Air Force 390th Bomb Group history. Charles, it's a pleasure to meet you. So, how old were you when you went to Europe?
I was 19.
Wow.
I am 98 now.
That's amazing, Charles. Thank you. I don't even know where to begin with you. I mean, is there a mission that sticks out for you?
Yes, I call it my worst mission, and that was to Munich in July of 1944. The target was a jet engine manufacturing plant inside the city limits of Munich, which made it difficult for us because we prided ourselves in not bombing civilians. And it's very difficult to pick out a small place in a town and just hit the target with 1,000 airplanes. We flew B-17G to Italy, dropped tons of bombs on the target, and our plane was hit over the target, and we sustained a hole in the right wing size of a bathtub, and we couldn't continue to keep up with the formation. We had to drop back, and the plane was on fire, and inboard engine on the right side was gone and on fire. So we couldn't put it out by normal means. So the pilot decided to dive the airplane from 26,500 feet to ground level to try to blow out the flames, which were successful. But in the meantime, we lost the number 4 engine, which is on the right-hand side. And we were a target for fighter planes from Munich back to England. We wanted to land in Switzerland, but our command pilot told us, do not land in Switzerland, bring that plane home. So we were down to ground level, which kept us off of the radar, and every little village, every little town outpost that shot at us at treetop level. We got back to the coast of England and the coast of France and at Dunkirk and started across the channel, and the big 16-inch guns were firing at us. And we finally lost another engine. Now we were flying on one engine, and we threw out all of the equipment that we could get loose in order to get over the White Cliffs of Dover, and discovered that our landing gear wouldn't come down, and we manually had to crank it down. And just as the wheels went down, we went over the cliffs of Dover, and there was an emergency landing field there, and we came out with over 600 holes in our airplane and was still flying. So that was the worst mission.
That's amazing.
Yes, very terrifying, and I called on all my childhood church experiences for prayer, and I'm certain that the Lord heard me.
And you were highly decorated for what you accomplished there.
Yes, a lot of decorations, and one that I cherish is the
French Legion of Honor medal?
Yes, and it was presented to me by the president of France. I keep saying the king, but it's the president. And it's a beautiful, beautiful medal. It's been a great deal to me. He declared that I was Chevalier, which is the highest decoration that the French people on offer for either their own people or foreigners.
Well, you sure deserved it, Charles. An honor to speak with you. And again, thank you for your service. As the owner of an equestrian training center in Florida, M.L. Gallagher was encouraged to write a series of short stories about horses a couple of years back. But it was a story she started thinking about while growing up in an area where the Civil War was fought that inspired her to write Home.
I was a big history buff growing up. My father was very much into history, and because we lived in Charleston, West Virginia, and we had a farm in Amherst, Virginia, we used to travel through that area, and there was a lot of Civil War stuff there, a lot of historical sites, a lot of things, and my father used to stop along the side of the road and march us into the woods to explore where the soldiers had been. So it led me into wanting to write this story about a young family during the Civil War in the mountains of West Virginia. Carrie and Jason, they are a couple that meet very young and then end up marrying, and of course he goes off to the war, and they had a cabin in a little mountain place, and she gets left at home to try to fend for herself, and he goes off to the war, and he doesn't come home, and she thinks he's dead, so she goes on with her life, so to speak. And then he comes home, but what he finds is not what he wants, so he never even tells her he comes home, and then he goes west. So the book actually ends up being more about his travels west after his service in the Civil War. It touches a little bit on the post-traumatic stress syndrome that happened to the Civil War veterans, more so than anybody ever thought about. And then it's about her being probably as much a heroine as he is a hero, but she was a strong mountain woman who lived with what happened to her and then manages to get through it all. And he does eventually come home and stays home, but it takes him a long time. Because when he comes home the first time, she is living with another man, but he doesn't even find out what's going on. He didn't show his face, he just leaves. And then he wanders around out west and eventually comes back, and then he finds out what the whole story was. And that's why the book is called Home. So, I did all the original releases, and then I have a group that I fox hunt with. I've done a couple of book signings at some horse shows. It's been on Facebook, but I live in a very small town, and I actually live 12 miles from the closest town. I did recently hear actually a radio announcement about the closest town to me does have a local author thing, and I have been planning on getting in touch with them and see what I can do there. I want to talk to the veterans and that stuff because, I never come right out and say, well, this guy's suffering from PTSD, but he is. And if you're familiar with it, my brother-in-law did, and if you're familiar with it, how he acts in the story directly says that's what's wrong with him. Like him and one other of the characters are both having a problem with it. And then the other thing, too, when I was doing research for the book, I ran across a book that was about, the veterans and going home and stuff, and their families were afraid of them. Their wives had never been around somebody who'd murdered people. And then they still thought of it that way. And the Union soldiers apparently didn't do any better than the rebels because everybody suffered. And even though they were the victors, they were treated like Vietnam veterans. And most of them fell apart. Most of them came home and completely were ruined. And then a lot of them did go west where they could earn a living with a gun and could continue doing what they'd been doing because
that's all they knew.
That's who they thought they were. They didn't know how to not be soldiers.
Bet we could learn a lot from them, and compare it to what our soldiers go through today. Thanks, M.L. Gallagher. L.J. Russell is a middle school history teacher living outside Syracuse, where he's often fantasized about those little isolated cabins on the lakes of the Adirondack Mountains, which eventually inspired his book, The Moon Lake Legend.
It's about a little resort. Sometimes you hear people call them mom and pop places on this isolated lake. And the guy who owned it dies, and his daughter decides to take it up, and she's there trying to make it work. There's a college-age kid who plays football who goes up there forced by his father to stay away, get out of trouble. There's the guy who owns the only private house on the lake, and that is a SU professor, and he knows what the Moon Lake legend is. He knows the history of the lake. There's the girl who had just graduated from high school and very smart, dysfunctional family, doesn't have a lot of money to go to college, and she's working at the place to try to make money to get out of the mountains. And they're all there until the actual Moon Lake legend comes alive, and they have to deal with it. And you get to see the strengths and weaknesses of these people when they're faced with the real danger that confronts them.
Right.
It's kind of like this thing you hear about but don't really know about. But the legend is that the American Indians in the mountains find this stone, they say it's from space. And whenever they come in contact with it, horrible things happen. So they throw it in the lake. But the legend is that occasionally there's an earthquake and the land moves, the stone is woken up, and something terrible will happen when the stone does get woken up. So, and of course, not to give too much away, but that obviously happens. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a book, wouldn't be a story. It's interesting in a way because the people who have read it, and I've had friends and critics look at it and give me reviews on it, and they people say they love the characters. And they really worry about how the characters are going to make out when this actually occurs. And to me, that's great. When people love the characters, the story's better. If you're really worried about how they're going to, end up, you're going to continue reading and you're going to get into it. And I think that's a strength of it.
I mean, when you make a character so believable that you feel like you could know them, that this could be a real person, and it makes you empathize, it makes you care.
Yeah. And the thing is that all these characters have more flaws and issues that they're dealing with besides just this legend. When it comes about, they have other things that they're dealing with that have nothing to do with what's about to happen to them. So you really understand. I've had people review it, say, I would really relate it to this person. Or sometimes I feel like this person. And you latch onto that and you hope for the best for them or whatever happens down in the story down the road.
It sounds like you really enjoy the process.
I started writing my first book in 1989. I was just out of college, didn't know what I was doing, had nothing else to do. And I have these stories bounced around in my head. And my father was a computer guy. And he gave me a compact computer and told me how to get on WordPerfect. And it just came out. I just started writing. And I do enjoy it. For me, it's a hobby and it's not work. It's something I just love to do. I love to go to that place. I love to be there with the characters in the situation that they're dealing with. If anybody wants to look on Goodreads, the app, there are reviews of people that I have no idea who they are. They've reviewed it. I've got the book in book shows.
You're a teacher. People must know who you are.
Oh, yeah. And where I teach in Geneva, New York, a lot of the people there have read it. The school district has done a write-up about my book. And I've done signings for people who I haven't seen in years, and they saw the article in the paper. And, oh, my God, is that the L.J. Russell that my daughter went to school with? And they buy the book, and I sign it. So that happens. I've had kids who, have graduated and send me emails that I read your book, loved it, and had one girl who went in, wanted me to answer all these questions about it. So that kind of thing is happening. But what I need to do is have people outside of my town and the people, the circle of friends I have, when I can get other people interested in it, then I hope it'll, more people will enjoy it.
All right. Well, hopefully this is a start, LJ. Thank you. Do you believe in dreams, premonitions, communicating with dead loved ones? More on that coming up right after these words.
Have you written a book and want to get it published? Then now's the time to call Page Publishing at 800-204-6099 and do it immediately. You see, they're looking for authors of all types of books. And unlike most publishers, Page Publishing will take the time to review most of the books submitted to them. And they'll even give you their feedback. And if they like what they read, Page Publishing will get your book into bookstores and for sale online at Amazon, the Apple iTunes Store, and other outlets. They'll handle everything. copyright protection, printing, cover art, publicity, and editing. So if you've written a novel, a children's book, a cookbook, inspirational work, a book of poetry, or biography, and want to get it published, then you need to call Page Publishing and do it immediately. Call 800-204-6099 now for your free author submission kit. Your road to fame and fortune could very well start with this simple phone call. For your free author submission kit, call Page Publishing at 800-204-6099.
We're back on the Page Publishing Book Club. I'm Alice Stockton Rossini. Do you believe in dreams? Do you have premonitions? Do you communicate with loved ones after they're dead? Well, Gregory Tinnen attempts to answer these questions in his book entitled Sleep Gnosis. It's a practice he's been studying for decades.
The main thing is the help that it gives to a lot of people who have lost loved ones. This particular technique, you see these people on TV all the time. It's kind of frustrating to say they're talking to their dead relatives and so forth. And it basically boils down to this. You could have one of these people tell you what your relative is saying, or you could have a vision of them and talk to them yourself. And it kept happening over and over again. I have seen a number of relatives and friends that have passed on and had a much better conversation with them than talking through some medium. And so I kept working on this sleep technique, which is basically a lot of things wrapped into one. Transcendental meditation and frequency and white noise and sleep deprivation. You put all this stuff together and you can reach a level of meditation or nirvana that, you don't have to sit cross-legged for hours or study the technique for 20 years or 12 years to learn how to, go into transcendental meditation. Basically, you can just do it, do a nice, comfortable in your home and just take a little bit of time to do some sleep deprivation and then lie in a particular way in your bed in order to achieve a little bit of acupressure in certain areas of your body, and then sort of instead of a mantra, which of course is with transcendental meditation, you can use some other things like a fan or a radio on static, and these things will create a frequency or a mantra that's the easy way to get to it without sitting there, cross-legged chanting for hours. And I learned all these things, and then once I put all this together, I shared it with some people, and it works in some cases a little too well. Some people, it frightens them because they go so far deep into that they see things they don't like, which can happen. So I put it in a book and I'll share it with whoever wants to read the book. And it's just a small, I think it's 35 pages or something, which 40 pages. But the techniques and the time involved it could have been, 350 pages, but instead of explaining to people all the Sinoi Indian techniques and the Sufi masters and everything, I just put it all in the little technique. And if you want to read more about how it works, you can go to those books, which I read and studied.
This is for the express purpose of talking to loved ones that have passed?
It's not the express purpose. It happens. But for instance, it does a lot of premonition. For instance, the Bible talks about dreams over and over again that help people through times. Even the birth of Jesus was a vision. So it's also premonitions. For instance, George Foreman, dreamed that he would defeat his next opponent in the second round, and that's exactly when it happened. But the ones that are more fun to think about, Paul McCartney dreamed the melody for the song Yesterday, and he dreamed it so clearly that he woke up and played it on a piano almost note for note. And he called it Scrambled Eggs at first because he didn't have the words, he just had the melody. And that probably produced one of the most famous and recorded songs of all time, and that came through a dream. And in addition, Paul also claims that his deceased mother Mary came to him in a dream and told him to let it be after she had passed on. So not only did she come to him in a dream, she told him to let it be. And of course, he wrote the song Let It Be. So the book boils it down into, a small pamphlet that you can read in a half an hour, 45 minutes. and then start to try the technique and see if it works for you.
I might take you up on that, Gregory. Thank you. A former cop, Nelson B. Johns, owns his own rig in South Carolina, and when he's on the road, he has time to think about stories. A big Tom Clancy fan, he dreamed up a plot with a U.S. sleeper cell for his book, Sleeper Cell Alpha One.
His name is John. He could never understand why everything happened in the wrong way for him. He never got a break in life. And we come to find out that was his training. He was secretly being trained, thrown into situations that were life threatening, and in America, in just normal society. In the series of 5 that I'm making, it's going to come out probably in the second one. He was set in the middle of the desert in Arizona, and the truck broke down, and he had to basically walk out because he couldn't get any signal. He couldn't get anybody to come help him, and he was stuck there with no food and water. So he had to survive his way to a gas station, basically, which was 50, 100 miles away. And these instances were showing him how to survive. And while he was doing that, the training was being kind of recorded in the chip for later events.
So somebody put a chip in his head.
Yes, he was involved in an accident when he was young, and his father, went into an agreement with a company, and the company put a chip in his head and for an experiment, paid the father. The father wasn't exactly the greatest guy in the world. He took the money and let him do experiment on his son.
Wow, nice guy.
Yeah. Well, he never knew until he met the colonel that started this program, and then the colonel took him to the base, and he was all in because he was at the end of his rope. He just didn't know what the heck to do anymore. So he was all in, and he followed the colonel to this base and met a doctor that was actually the one in charge of the program. It was kind of a medical program, and the doctor had aspirations, to help people, not to train, agents, but he wanted to help people, overcome adversities, like dyslexia and stuff like that. And then what they do is they activate the chip, and everything comes to light to him. It becomes clear as to what he was being trained for. All that knowledge that was being stored is now in him, and it helps him get through situations. He can close his eyes and see the outcome.
I want that chip.
Yeah, me too.
You're planning 5 books, and we were going to watch him on various missions?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I took most of the second book out of the first book. And in doing so, I turned it into a small novel. I was actually a little depressed about the size of the novel, and I was kind of kicking myself for saying, why didn't I put that stuff in? Basically, the second novel is going to be another mission, and he involves himself with another. There are more than one of these people out there being secretly trained, and one of them is bad. He's like the Darth Vader of this situation. So this is just the first mission.
All right. Sounds like a good one, Nelson. Thank you. Jeannie Troll, a retired social worker, psychotherapist, musician, and writer, imagines what it would be like to be a female genius living with a disability in the early 7th century who's forced to deal with an older, beautiful, mysterious, and troubled girl who comes to live in her household. The name of her book, A Clever Girl, Part 1.
My book is called A Clever Girl, and it's about a young girl, a child named Achtriel, who was a foundling adopted into a group of very underground Jewish scholars who are into preserving the books of the past, copying them. A community of people like that, smart, unorthodox. She has this grandfather who adopted her named Tato. He's very, very brilliant. And he is a scholar, and he runs a school, and he notices that she picks everything up really quickly. And he recognizes she's unusual. The other thing about her is that she has cerebral palsy. Part of the reason I included that is because when I first moved to California, I worked at an independent living center. And I got to feel like, why should people with disabilities just be treated like outside people that nobody wanted to look at? And I had this flash that, like, that is something I want to write about. My main character feels like a total freak. She's treated like a total freak. She's a loner. And it's about her development. Another main character shows up when Tato gets a letter from his brother from Constantinople saying he's coming. They had to leave for some undisclosed crisis. And when he shows up, he brings with him a 13-year-old Ethiopian girl who's extremely beautiful, but very troubled. And her name is Tirza. So I want to make this into a series. And Tirza and Actrial, they start out being sisters, kind of fighting all the time. And actually, Tirza is very sympathetic to Actrial and kind of has a protective role. But this is not clear until later. But the development of their relationship between the very smart outsider, freaky girl and another one who looks like she would be fine because she's beautiful, but is actually very troubled. That was my experience with my best friend when I was growing up. And I thought there was something very common about that combination. So one of the characters is getting married, and there's also this group of women, maybe from the Basque culture, which is completely different than any other European culture, right? These women live in the woods, and people consider them witches, and they come to the wedding. And it turns out that the slave girl, who is one of them, is pregnant. She's hiding in the woods. So Actrial contacts them and then walks through the woods, and in the process totally messes up her fancy dress that Tirza made for her. She doesn't want to say anything because she's not sure that the two women are safely back in their village in the woods. And it ends on a big misunderstanding.
And this is just the beginning, right? We got a sequel coming up. Nice work, Jeannie. And this is just the end of this edition of the Page Publishing Book Club. Go to 710WOR.com and download the podcast. We'll see you next time. I'm Alice Stockton Rossini.